October 14, 1943 at 1647 hours at Thorpe Abbotts, England. The B-17 flying fortress lurched to a halt on the runway with its number 3. Engine dead and number 2 belching smoke, Lieutenant. Colonel James Shannon circled the aircraft, tallying the perforations, 17. Through the left wing, 23 in the fuselage, and 8 clustered near the tail gunners. Station. The aluminum skin pocked like a sieve. His navigator, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, clambered down the nose hatch, his flight suit drenched in sweat, despite the sub-zero air at $25,000 fa. "Skipper, we shouldn't be alive," Morrison said tightly. "Jerry threw everything at us over Schweinfurt." Shannon traced a line of bullet holes running the length of the fuselage, just inches clear of the fuel tanks. Around them, other fortresses were coming in many trailing smoke, some signaling wounded with red flares. Of the 291 B-17s sent to Schweinfurt that morning to strike ball-bearing plants, 60 never returned. Another 17 were found to be irreparable, and 121 of the survivors required major work before they could fly again. The arithmetic was grim. At that attrition rate, a bomber crew's odds of surviving a required 25-mission tour were under 30%. While Colonel Shannon inspected his riddled bomber, counting holes and wondering at their luck, 200 miles away in a plain apartment house near Columbia University in Manhattan, a Hungarian Jewish refugee mathematician was on the verge of solving a problem that would save hundreds of crews. His name was Abraham Wald, and his idea would transform military thinking and statistical science alike. The battered B-17 Shannon had flown was exactly the sort of evidence the United States Army Air Forces had been compiling for months. Every returning bomber was carefully checked. Every bullet puncture mapped, cataloged, and measured as technical. Sergeants with clipboards recorded damage locations on standard diagrams. The pattern was strikingly consistent. The fuselage averaged 1.73 holes per square foot, the wings 1.21, and the fuel system 155, while some spots, notably around the engines and cockpit, showed remarkably few hits, sometimes as low as 0.3 per square foot. To the officers at Wright Field, Ohio, the remedy looked plain. Major General Oliver Eccles, head of the Material Command, convened a meeting in September 1943 and pointed to a chart of damage across a B-7 silhouette. "Gentlemen, the data speaks for itself," he declared. "We must armor the most struck areas, reinforcing the fuselage and strengthening the wings." The reasoning seemed irrefutable. You protect where bullets strike most often, but Eccles faced a constraint. Weight. A B-17G already had an empty weight of 36,135 lb, and every pound of armor reduced bomb load, fuel, and agility. The fortress could bear roughly 6,500 lb of extra armor, but it had to be applied with surgical accuracy. Placed wrongly, it would weigh the plane down with no gain. 6 weeks before that disastrous Schweinfurt raid, the question had been passed to the statistical research group at Columbia University. The SRG occupied 3 floors of an apartment near the campus, its windows painted black for security, its very existence unknown to most in the military. Inside, 18 of America's top mathematical minds, recruited through what SRG Director Alan Wallace called the old boy network of academic statisticians, were at work. They had already tackled problems from optimal convoy formations to the probability calculations for the Norden bomb site. Abraham Wald, who had joined the group in 1943, was one of several European refugee scholars whose talents were reshaping the American war effort. Born in 1902 in Kodva, then part of Austria-Hungary, now Clujoca, Romania, Wald had been homeschooled because, as an Orthodox Jew, he could not attend school on Saturdays under Hungarian law. His brilliance had led to a post at the University of Vienna until the 1938 ANCUS ended that career, and he fled to the United States, where Columbia University offered him a position. Instead of abstract theory, he was now applying his mind to keep airmen alive. The Air Force delivered boxes of reports, photographs, and measurements to the SRG in late August 1943, with Captain Robert McNamara, then at the Office of Statistical Control, overseeing the collection. The hit patterns were unmistakable: heavy damage to fuselage and wings, and scant hits on engines and cockpit. Wald spent 3 days poring over the material in silence. His colleague Milton Freriedman later remembered, Wald sitting smoking his pipe quiet for hours, then abruptly making a mark on paper and returning to his reverie. Other SRG statisticians had already started computing where to put armor based on hit frequency when Wald finally spoke at their September 2nd meeting. "You are all wrong," he said simply. "The Air Force is wrong, you are. Looking at this backwards." The room fell silent, and Frederick Mostella, a young statistician who would later head the American Statistical Association, asked what everyone was thinking. "Abraham, the data is clear these areas receive the most damage. How can reinforcing them be wrong?" Wald rose, walked to the blackboard, drew a simple B17 outline, and marked the locations the Air Force data showed as heavily struck. "These aircraft came back," he observed. "They suffered this damage and still made it home." He tapped the fuselage and wings on his sketch and repeated that every returning bomber showed hits in those spots, yet still returned. Then he drew a second B-17 outline and asked a simple question. Where are the planes that never returned, and what did their damage look like? He shaded the spots that showed little harm on the survivors, the engines, the cockpit, the tail control surfaces, and pointed out that if enemy fire were essentially random, we would expect hits to be spread evenly over the airframe. They were not. The missing damage, he argued, belonged to the missing aircraft. The realization struck like lightning. Statistician Leonard Jimmy Savage later called it one of the war's most graceful insights. The Air Force had been studying only the survivors and treating them as if they represented every mission. Wald saw that they were observing only the half of the story that lived to be observed. He put the idea into math-writing probability formulas on the board and saying assume reasonably that German flak and fighters are not carefully aiming at particular components from miles away. If fire is random, damage should be uniform. If the returning planes show a lopsided pattern while enemy fire is uniform, then the areas with disproportionately few hits are likely where a hit meant the aircraft never returned. Those are the vulnerable spots, and those are where protection belongs. George Stigler, who was present later, wrote that once Abraham explained it, the answer seemed obvious, though none of them had seen it before. Everyone had stared at the data while Abraham examined what was absent from it. The consequences were enormous. The Air Force was poised to armor the parts that proved best at surviving hits while leaving truly critical areas exposed, a move that could worsen losses rather than reduce them. Wald did not stop at the insight. Over the next 3 weeks, he built a formal model for where armor would do the most good, producing 8 memoranda that went well beyond observation. He derived vulnerability coefficients for different sections of the airplane that combined hit probabilities with functional importance. A strike to the aileron control cables could be far more deadly than several holes in non-structural fuselage skin. On September 20th, 1943, he laid out his full findings to Air Force delegates. Brigadier General Orville Anderson of the 8th Bomber Command had flown in from England for the session and met Wald's conclusions with skepticism. "Professor Wald, you want us to ignore the visible battle, damage and armor parts that look untouched." Wald answered with hard numbers. "Your loss rates are unsustainable. In August, you lost 60 B-17s on Schweinfurt and Regensburg missions, about 600 men, and your own records show 38 of those aircraft suffered engine failures before crashing, suggesting engine armor might have prevented many losses." He produced another chart showing the June raid on Kiel, where 26 planes were lost and returning crews reported at least 15 going down after cockpit hits. Yet cockpit damage among survivors was scarce. This was not random chance, but what he named survivorship bias, a term new then, coined by Wald during his analysis, and one that would become central to statistics. Anderson asked his aide, Major Thomas Powers, for the recent loss figures, and the verdict was grim. The 8th was losing aircraft faster than replacements arrived. "How much extra weight are we talking?" Anderson pressed. Wald had already calculated it. About 1/200 LEB of armor placed strategically around engines, cockpit, and control runs would offer more protection than 2,000 LEB spread, according to raw hit counts. The fix posed engineering headaches. The right-hand Cyclone engines were already prone to mechanical trouble. And adding armor required redesigning cowlings, shifting weight, and recalculating center of gravity. So, Boeing engineer Edward Wells was called in, and after review said it was doable, but would mean retrofitting every B-17 in England. By October 1943, after Black Thursday, when 77 B-17s were lost in a single day, the Air Force was desperate enough that General Henry Hap Arnold personally ordered Wald's plan put into action. Retrofit teams began at once. Crews at modification centers working non-stop to bolt armor onto engines fit bulletproof glass in vulnerable cockpit positions and reinforce control cable runs. Technical Sergeant William Haney at the Huntington Modification Center recalled the urgency. Planes came back shredded by flak, and we were trying to patch them while fitting these new armor kits. Orders were to prioritize the retrofit work above almost everything else. The changes met resistance among crews. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famed Memphis Belle, which had completed 25 missions on May 17, 1943, was at first doubtful, saying, "We already fly. Overloaded, and now they want to add weight to areas that never get hit." But Morgan spoke. From his own survival experience, unaware he was an example of the very bias Wald had exposed. He pointed out that the aircraft that made it back had taken those strikes and still returned, tapping the fuselage and wings on his sketch to prove the point. Then drew a second B-17 and asked where the planes that never came home were and what their damage looked like. He shaded the areas that showed little harm on the survivors, the engines, the cockpit, the tail control surfaces, and argued that if enemy fire were essentially random, we would expect hits to be spread evenly, which they were not. So the absent hits must belong to the missing aircraft. The realization landed like a thunderbolt. Leonard Jimmy Savage later called it one of the war's most graceful insights. The Air Force had been studying only the survivors and treating them as if they represented every mission. Wald saw they had only half the story. He put it into mathematics, writing probability formulas and assuming reasonably that German flak and fighters were not carefully aiming at particular components from miles away. If fire is random, damage should be uniform. So when returning planes show lopsided patterns, the logical conclusion is that strikes in the underrepresented zones were fatal, and those are the vulnerable spots that need protection. George Stigler later wrote that once Abraham explained it, the answer seemed obvious, though none of them had noticed it before. They had all stared at the data while Abraham examined what was missing. The stakes were huge. The Air Force was about to armor the parts that tolerated damage best while leaving critical systems exposed, which could have worsened losses. Wald did not stop at the insight. Over the next 3 weeks, he built a formal model and produced 8 memoranda assigning vulnerability, coefficients to airframe regions that combined hit, likelihood with functional criticality. For example, a hit to the aileron control cables could be far more deadly than multiple holes in non-structural fuselage skin. On September 20th, 1943, he presented the full analysis to Air Force officers. Brigadier General Orville Anderson of the 8th Bomber Command flew in, and at first pushed back. "Professor Wald, you want us to ignore visible battle damage in armor areas that look untouched?" Wald answered with hard numbers showing the losses were unsustainable. In August, you lost 60 B-7s on Schweinfurt and Regensburg missions, about 600 men, and your own reports show 38 of those aircraft suffered engine failures before going down, suggesting engine armor might have helped. He produced another chart of the June Kiel raid where 26 planes were lost, and returning crews reported at least 15 going down after cockpit hits. Yet cockpit damage among survivors was scarce. Evidence of what he named survivorship bias, a term he coined during the analysis that would become central to statistics. Anderson asked his aide, Major Thomas Powers, for the latest loss figures, and the numbers confirmed the crisis. The 8th was losing aircraft faster than replacements arrived. "How much weight are we talking?" Anderson asked. Wald had anticipated that and calculated that about 1,200 lb of armor, placed strategically around engines, cockpit, and control cables, would do more good than 2,000 lb distributed according to raw hit counts. The fix posed engineering headaches. The B-7's right-hand Cyclone engines were already prone to mechanical trouble, and adding armor meant redesigning cowlings, shifting loads, and recalculating the center of gravity. So Boeing engineer Edward Wells was brought in, and after review said it was possible, but would require retrofitting every B-7 in England. By October 1943, after Black Thursday, when 77 B-7s were lost in a single day, the Air Force was desperate, and General Henry Hap Arnold personally ordered Wald's recommendations put into effect. Retrofit teams began immediately as modification centers in England worked non-stop, adding armor plates to engines, fitting bulletproof glass in vulnerable cockpit positions, and reinforcing control cable runs. Technical Sergeant William Haney at the Huntington Modification Center recalled the urgency. Planes came back shredded by flak, and we were patching them while installing the new armor kits with orders to prioritize those modifications above almost everything else, and the changes met resistance from crews. Captain Robert Morgan, pilot of the famed Memphis Belle, which had completed 25 missions on May 17, 1943, was initially doubtful, saying they already flew overloaded and now wanted to add weight to places that never get hit. But Morgan was judging from his own survival experience and unaware he was an example of the very bias Wald had exposed. Combat flights by the first upgraded B-17s began in November 1943. And the impact was immediate and striking. Losses fell even as mission intensity increased, and by December, despite deeper penetrations into Germany, the 8th Air Force's loss rate per sortie plunged from 9.1% to 3.5%. The retrofit program quickly widened until all U.S. heavy bombers were being modified. Lieutenant Colonel John Bennett, who had flown 31 missions in both unarmored and armored fortresses, noticed the change. His first tour felt like Russian roulette, but after the upgrades, planes still took hits yet more often limped home instead of being lost. The statistics bore that out. In the 6 months before Wald's changes, the 8th lost 66 B-17s. In the 6 months after full rollout, despite tougher targets and more missions, losses fell to 371. Every bomber preserved meant roughly 10 crewmen returned to their families rather than becoming casualties or POWs. Wald's influence reached far beyond plates and glass. His methods reshaped military analysis across services. The Navy adopted similar survivability calculations for ships. The RAF re-examined its bomber losses and found the same patterns, and captured German records showed the enemy began to apply comparable thinking to their aircraft. Colonel Curtis Lame, who later directed strategic bombing against Japan, pored over Wald's memoranda and wrote that Wald taught us to notice what was absent. In war, the most important data is often the data you cannot collect. The idea had quick application outside aviation. Medics rethought casualty data and shifted frontline first aid toward injuries survivable with immediate treatment. At the Statistical Research Group, Wald's success led to broader work. He developed sequential analysis for ammunition quality control that spared millions of rounds unnecessary inspection and designed search patterns that saved dozens of downed airmen in the Pacific. Herbert Solomon later observed that while others attacked problems head-on, Wald always asked what they were not seeing. Perhaps his narrow escape from Nazi Europe made him sensitive to the peril of counting only survivors. The human effects showed up in personal stories. Staff Sergeant James Hensley, a ball turret gunner with the 381st Bomb Group, recalled being hit over Berlin in March 1944 when a shell fragment tore through the turret and struck the armor plate fitted behind his head. What would once have killed him only stunned him. Technical Sergeant Roy Vasquez of the 91st Bomb Group lost the No. 2 engine to flak over Frankfurt before the upgrades. Because armor had protected fuel lines, his crew managed to limp home on 3 engines instead of burning or bailing out. The modifications were not flawless. Crews complained of reduced speed and agility, longer takeoff runs from England's often fog-bound short airfields, and slightly higher fuel use. But those trade-offs paled beside the rise in survivability. By early 1944, Wald's principles had been codified. The Air Force Statistical Control Office under Charles Tex Thornton folded survivorship bias reasoning into planning. Analysts used the same approach to pick fuel tank armor for the long-range P-51 escorts, which cut ground fire losses. and the Pacific Theater saw B-29s and naval dive and torpedo planes fitted with armor schemes adapted from Wald's work, as marine aviation recorded markedly better survival during island campaigns. Robert McNamara, who had helped gather the original damage reports and later became Secretary of Defense, frequently cited Wald as proof that rigorous quantitative analysis could save lives. Mathematical insight could expose how even well-informed intuition might be precisely wrong. The Germans noticed too. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland later wrote that American bombers had become unexpectedly harder to kill, that strikes which should have been fatal failed to bring planes down. And though German pilots concentrated increasingly on engine shots, those attacks grew more hazardous as they flew through concentrated defensive fire. German losses rose as tactics adapted to counter the new protections. Meanwhile, the underlying data set continued to grow. By war's end, the Air Force had recorded damage on more than 45,000 returned sorties, and the same pattern held. Heavy hits to fuselage and wings, but relatively few to engines and cockpits, exactly as Wald's reasoning predicted. Post-war analysis made the cost of the blind spot painfully clear. Had Wald's recommendations been adopted 6 months earlier, roughly 300 aircraft and about 3,000 airmen might have been spared. In December 1943, 3 months after Wald's initial briefing, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, a series of massive raids on German aircraft production. The first B-17 bombers fitted with changes designed from statistical analysis entered combat in November 1943, and the effect was both immediate and undeniable. Missions that had previously seen catastrophic losses suddenly became survivable, and the numbers proved it. Even as the raids became longer and more dangerous, the 8th Air Force saw its loss rate fall from over 9% to just 3.5% within a month. By December, the bombers were flying deeper into Germany than ever before, yet bringing more crews home alive. The program of changes grew so large that eventually every American heavy bomber in the European theater received the modifications. Men who had flown before and after the improvements could feel the difference in their bones. Lieutenant Colonel John Bennett, who flew 31 missions in both unmodified and modified B-17s, described his first tour as playing Russian roulette. Every time they went out, it felt like waiting for fate to strike. But after the armor and reinforcements were added, he admitted that while bombers were still torn up by enemy fire, many that once would have fallen from the sky were now able to limp back to base with wounded but living crews. The numbers told the same story. In the half-year before Wald's changes, the 8th Air Force lost 66 B-17s, and in the half-year after his recommendations were fully adopted, despite more missions and stronger enemy defenses, losses dropped to 371. That meant thousands of men who would have been dead or captured instead returned home. Each bomber saved meant 10 more families spared telegrams of death or missing in action. Wald's influence extended far beyond placing steel plates on bombers. His methods revolutionized the way militaries analyze survival. The Navy began studying ship damage through his lens. The Royal Air Force re-examined its bomber losses and confirmed similar patterns. And even German intelligence learned of his methods through captured material and tried to apply them to their own forces. Colonel Curtis LeMay, who would later command the devastating bombing campaign against Japan, admitted he read Wald's memoranda repeatedly. He said Wald taught them to look not just at what was there, but at what was absent. In war, he wrote, the most vital information is often the data you cannot collect because it died with those who did not return. This principle spread quickly to other branches. When doctors examined infantry casualty records, they realized the data only included men who survived long enough to reach medical tents. Many others had died instantly and were invisible in reports. This understanding caused medics to shift battlefield care toward injuries that could be saved with immediate treatment. At the Statistical Research Group, Wald's success with bomber survivability earned him more responsibilities. He created sequential testing techniques for ammunition that allowed factories to avoid wasting millions of bullets on unnecessary inspections. He devised optimal search strategies for downed pilots across the vast Pacific Ocean, and those strategies rescued countless stranded airmen. His colleague Herbert Solomon later reflected that while most of them attacked problems directly, Wald always asked what was missing from the picture. Perhaps his escape from Austria just ahead of the Nazi purge gave him a sharper awareness of the unseen. His personal history shaped the way he thought, and that mindset saved lives. The human side of these abstract numbers showed in stories from men in the field. Staff Sergeant James Hensley, a ball turret gunner with the 381st Bomb Group, remembered a mission over Berlin in March 1944 when flak pierced his turret and struck the armor plate added behind his head. Before Wald's improvements, that fragment would have killed him instantly, but instead he walked away with a concussion. Technical Sergeant Roy Vasquez of the 91st Bomb Group recalled losing an engine over Frankfurt. In the past, that meant certain fire and a bailout, but because the fuel lines were shielded, the bomber limped back on 3 engines. The modifications did bring complaints. Crews noted the planes were a little slower, harder to maneuver, required longer takeoffs on England's short, foggy runways, and consumed more fuel. Yet these were minor compared with the chance to see another dawn. By the start of 1944, Wald's approach became official doctrine. The Air Force's Statistical Control Office, led by Charles Tex Thornton, adopted survivorship bias analysis into all planning. When the P-51 Mustang was introduced as a long-range escort, analysts used Wald's reasoning to decide where its fuel tanks needed armor. In the Pacific, the B-29 Superfortress received armor layouts adapted from his findings, and Navy and Marine air units saw survival rates rise sharply during island-hopping campaigns. Robert McNamara, then a young analyst collecting bomber data and later U.S. Secretary of Defense, cited Wald's work for decades afterward. He said it proved that even the best military intuition can be fatally misleading while mathematics tells the truth. The Germans themselves admitted the effect. Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland recalled in his memoirs that the American bombers suddenly became harder to destroy. Their pilots reported that hits which once brought fortresses down now often failed. They suspected new armor but never grasped the systematic analysis behind it. German training adjusted to emphasize engine shots, but this forced pilots to fly into the thickest defensive fire, raising their own losses. Meanwhile, the evidence grew undeniable. By war's end, the Air Force had detailed records on more than 45,000 missions flown by returning aircraft. The patterns were always the same. Wings and fuselages shredded, but engines and cockpits relatively untouched among the survivors. Every piece of data confirmed Wald's theory. Analysts later calculated that if his advice had been applied just 6 months earlier, 300 bombers and 3,000 men might have been spared. The cost of delay was measured in lives that could not be replaced. In late 1943, the 8th Air Force launched Operation Argument, a massive bombing campaign against German aircraft factories. Despite the heaviest fighter resistance of the war, the bombers held on. In January 1944, General James Doolittle took command of the 8th and openly credited the survivability changes for allowing them to keep the pressure on. He wrote that without Wald's contribution, they would have been forced to stop and rebuild, which would have dragged the air war on for many more months. Crews themselves felt the difference not just in their safety, but in their spirits. Knowing their planes had been studied by the finest mathematical minds in the nation gave them a sense of protection. Letters home often mentioned the new armor as a source of comfort. First Lieutenant William Pickering wrote to his wife that bright fellows had figured out exactly where they needed protection and that it gave him courage to fly dangerous missions. Not all were convinced immediately. Colonel Dale Smith of the 384th Bomb Group initially resisted, insisting that his crews knew best where planes were hit and that no professor could tell them otherwise. Yet when his losses fell by 40% after modifications, he reversed himself, later becoming a strong supporter of statistical analysis and using his own skepticism as a lesson. Wald himself remained humble, telling a university newspaper that he had only applied standard methods to available numbers and that the true heroes were the crews providing the data. But in truth, his insight transformed military thinking. Until then, analysis was based mainly on experience and visible events. Afterward, it became precise, mathematical, and able to account for what was unseen. Naval officers realized their understanding of submarine losses was skewed toward surviving boats. Army leaders recognized that tactics built from survivor accounts missed the silent testimony of the dead. Across every service, the way information was gathered shifted to account for the missing, as well as the surviving. Dr. Warren Weaver, head of the Applied Mathematics panel, declared Wald's work the single most important statistical contribution of the war. High praise from a group that had already revolutionized code-breaking and artillery science. Yet the work drained Wald personally. He aged visibly under the pressure of seeing life and death tied to his calculations, of studying photographs of torn aircraft stained with blood, of knowing that every number represented men gone forever. His colleague Alan Wallace recalled his hair turning gray and lines deepening on his face during those years. Still, Wald pressed on. His third memorandum tackled the thickness of armor, his fourth the balance between weight of armor and defensive guns, each refinement squeezing out more chances of survival. By D-Day in June 1944, every American heavy bomber incorporated his ideas, and the massive aerial support for the invasion, over 11,000 sorties in a single day, was only possible because loss rates had fallen to sustainable levels. Eisenhower himself later said that maintaining air superiority at acceptable costs was essential to success. The statistics on D-Day proved the point. Of more than 1,200 bombers dispatched, only 28 were lost, just over 2%. A year earlier, similar missions had seen more than 10% losses. After the war, the Strategic Bombing Survey confirmed the full extent of Wald's contribution. Examining wrecked aircraft across Europe, investigators found the fatal damage exactly where Wald had insisted armor was needed. Captured German records revealed frustration as American bombers became tougher to destroy. One commander wrote that the fortresses had turned into flying tanks, able to take punishment that once would have brought them down. Wald's concept spread into civilian life after the war. Survivorship bias became a standard principle in economics, finance, medicine, and research of all kinds. Analysts recognized that mutual funds looked better than they really were if only surviving funds were counted. Doctors realized treatments seemed more effective if only patients who lived long enough to finish therapy were included. Business researchers discovered that imitating successful companies often failed because the hidden failures were ignored. Colonel Jacob Beezer, who later helped plan the atomic bomb missions, summed up the lesson that in any analysis you must ask, who is not in the room? What evidence has been lost, and whose story ended before it could be told? Even with these insights, the human cost remained immense. The 8th Air Force alone lost 26,000 killed and 28,000 wounded or captured. But studies showed those numbers would have been 30 to 40% worse without Wald's analysis, meaning around 10,000 lives were saved by mathematical reasoning. Veterans' voices make those numbers human. Lieutenant Richard Cole, who had flown with Doolittle in the famous raid on Tokyo, survived 26 European missions in a modified B-17 and believed engine armor alone explained why he lived while identical planes were lost. Sergeant Anthony Picardi, a radio operator, remembered a 20mm shell shattering his cockpit plexiglass, yet being stopped cold by the armor plate. Without that plate, he said, both he and the pilot would have died. The improvements continued through the war's end, each new bomber incorporating lessons learned. The B-29 Superfortress, designed from the beginning with Wald's principles, suffered the lowest loss rate of any American heavy bomber, despite carrying out the most dangerous missions over Japan. His techniques even informed the study of enemy strategies, helping to analyze German fighter patterns, Japanese naval moves, and industrial capacity. The idea that missing information could be more valuable than present information became central to intelligence itself. In 1945, Wald received a commendation from General Arnold praising his mathematical insight for saving countless lives. But in typical fashion, he credited his colleagues at the SRG. After the war, his team went on to RAND, applying the same thinking to nuclear strategy, space exploration, and even Vietnam planning. Tragically, Wald himself did not live to see the full reach of his influence. In December 1950, while traveling in India to give lectures, he and his wife died in a plane crash in the Nilgiri Mountains. He was only 48. Friends noted the cruel irony that a man who had saved so many flyers was himself lost in an aircraft. At his memorial, one colleague said Wald saw what others could not. The ghosts in the data, the missing voices that told the true story, and that he saved more lives with mathematics than many generals did with armies. Decades later, the 8th Air Force Association raised a plaque at their museum in Savannah to honor him. Alongside tributes to famous commanders and medal recipients stands a dedication to Abraham Wald, the mathematician who saw the unseen and saved the unreturned. Veterans who spoke at the dedication admitted most had never heard his name during the war, but thousands owed their lives to him. They said he looked at holes in metal and saw the difference between life and death, and that his work was mathematics with a soul. The B-17 on display there carries armor placed exactly where Wald recommended, around engines, cockpits, and control cables, in spots that rarely showed damage on returning planes, but proved fatal on those that never came back. Guides explained to visitors how such reasoning saved more men than any tactical innovation. What now appears obvious is still taught in entry-level statistics classes, reminding students that the missing can matter more than the visible. In 1943, it took genius to see it. Wald's lesson endures in every field where people ask whether their data represents everyone or just survivors, in every discipline where someone asks what they are not seeing. His life itself illustrated the principle. He survived by fleeing Austria while most of his peers perished, and his survival allowed him to transform statistics. Those who were silenced carried with them knowledge lost forever. Wald's greatest gift was to teach that survival distorts what we think we know, and that only by remembering the absent and asking who is missing can we hope to approach truth. From the bullet holes of bombers came not only armor plates, but a lasting reminder that knowledge is shaped by those who never return. His work saved bombers and crews, reshaped military science, and gave the world a profound way to think about evidence and absence. In that sense, his legacy is larger than war itself, showing that sometimes